Third question from Sean. Delving into various super or super adjacent games, I'd like to ask about your experience with Aberrant. Question 1. Did you engage in any meaningful way with the game? Well, this seems to be a day for this kind of answer. The answer is easy. No, I haven't. This game came out in 1999, and I will say that I was deeply done with everything about the way role-playing games were being published. And I was now much more knowledgeable about it. Sorcerer had come out in its original form in 1996, and I had been learning a lot about role-playing game publishing up through this period. By the time I was seeing the game, which would have been into 2000 probably, when it was all over the stores, along with whatever else was at the time. And the Forge was just kicking into existence right then. And so the focus on independent publishing, grassroots play and publishing was what I wanted to do. The idea of whoever owned White Wolf now and whatever kind of world building and franchising they were doing with it was of no interest to me at all. I believe that the one I may have had, may still have, although I can't remember seeing it recently, a copy of one of their publications about it. But it wasn't the core book for Aberrant. For those of you who don't know, there's this world, franchise concept that was being published at this point, composed of 3 games. One of them set in what people perceived as the pulp era, which is very much a pop culture artifact with its own qualities that have very little to do with actual pulps from a century ago. But that aside, set in that, what gamers call pulp. Then there's this one, which is, this is so confusing. Okay. Started publication in 1999. In the fictional world in 1998, all these people got powers. And then play begins in 2008, the fictional 2008, 10 years after that event. And the idea that they have actually pretty powerful powers, and that, this goes on to Sean's question, his next part. So sticking with the first part, the answer is the idea of a comics-inspired, allegedly comics-inspired or relevant notions of a megaverse, of a long canonical history, and knowing how the creators and editors and publishers of White Wolf, no matter who they were and how that was shifting hands, were oriented toward these things, and the fact that there's supposed to be a line of books to read and other games to play, and that's me pointing at that whole package and saying, I'm out. And what I do is literally in defiance of that. So what don't I do? What is the Forge not about? That. So that's why, no real and meaningful engagement in the game. I did investigate some systemic stuff in the game, in that one version that I got. It was one of the later, not too much later, it was one of the supplemental materials, or playable supplemental materials for Aberrant, but I really was not into this. So the second question, however, fortunately, has some substantive content for me that I can answer substantively. Question 2, more of a comics question. Do you have any insight into the inspiration for a game like Aberrant, perhaps related to other games of the time as well? So, as well as comics. Yes, I do. First of all, of the major American comic book companies, DC Comics, which is a little teeny piece of Warner Communications, which is, of course, growing vaster and merging, all this time, has gone heavily into the movies. The success of Batman in 1989 and the continuing franchise of the Batman movies and the breakout success, the unexpected success of the animated Batman in the early 90s, and then its growth into a rather powerful set of material through that creative team, is occupying, Warner's attention. The comics themselves have undergone a phenomenally exploitative cycle of mega series. You'll recognize many of them. They date back to Crisis on Infinite Earths in the late 80s, but that itself, basically being an imitation of Secret Wars from Marvel. But here in the 90s, this has been turned into a science. The Death of Superman in particular was, like a mission to Mars in terms of its dedicated editorial control over exactly all references to it, all their timing, the events being done and then referenced in other titles and everything. I mean, it was truly a controlled phenomenon throughout that entire thing. And the content was literally of no interest. Very few creators. You can find it in DC. You can find several creators who have little carved out areas, usually with a compliant editor, who are trying to, who are enjoying what they're doing and writing what they want to a great extent, but they are scattered here and there. John Ostrander's Suicide Squad is an excellent example. And then there are all sorts of other little bits and pieces of weirdness here and there. One looks throughout and finds little pockets of cool or interesting or quirky or insightful. But the vast look at all of it is much, much more, it's in service to the franchise, is all I have to say. Marvel Comics is doing something that's now both iconic and notorious. Most people at the time, nobody really at the time, understood the ownership issues that were occurring throughout the history of Marvel. All of that stuff is now well understood, but not as well understood as it should be. Suffice to say that Marvel had become, even more so than it may have been in the past, a money laundering operation. Through a series of bizarre shell companies and shifts in ownership, to the extent where people in the offices, would have different people walk in claiming to be the owners and their bosses on different days. And the whole thing was just in meltdown, but was making money off of the speculative market more than anything else. So gross, fan bait, buy this, it's collectible, things were occurring. For some reason, people who should have known better were falling into this trap, and even distributors and store owners were stockpiling what was supposed to be these amazing, soon to be incredibly valuable, so it's all vapor. And in the meantime, as is notorious, extraordinarily excessive content was being thrown out. All the characters were now all edgelords, and anything bad that could happen to a character or made them dark or edgy, which basically meant making them shit stains, was all over the place. So you can go back and look at that and remember you buying all those issues of God knows what, and hang your head and say, my God, was I reading this crap? Because again, there was nothing there. So drawing upon comics for inspiration at that time was of very little interest to me, unless it was highly specific and responded to the insight that may have been available in this or that piece. But you certainly weren't going to get any of that from reboots of reboots of Morbius the Living Vampire into sort of an goth Anne Rice reject. Or I could just go on and on. I mean, it's appalling, really. And the fact that many of the creators, realizing that they were in a lunatic asylum, basically starting to self-parody, making these parodies of edgelords. But then those are taken seriously and praised, and all the speculative fans are like, oh yeah, this is fantastic. And I even know, some of the creators, and a lot of them were just like face palming and saying, you realize I was, fucking with you when I had the character do that. I mean, you have to show my contempt for what this whole thing has become, and everybody's like raving about how great it is. So yeah, it's not a great time for these characters and these companies and the nature of the content. So there's another aspect of it as well, and it ties into what Sean asks. Context. The text mentions, this is aberrant, briefly, that at the time of its creation, the literature of the time made comparisons to superheroes as gods. Okay. More comics context. Poor Alan Moore, who wrote some great things, wrote some irresponsible things or excessive things that I think were not particularly well thought out, and then wrote other things that were in the line of in-your-face take-that's. And for whatever reason, whatever he writes, it's taken as genius, even when it's not, or paraphrased into something that it's not, or elevated into some sort of academic or journalistic blither that it's not. And the latter is where people started talking about the superheroes, particularly Superman and Batman, at first as, modern gods. Now, talking about superheroes as modern mythology is it's been going on forever. This goes way back to before I was born, people talking about this stuff. And a lot of it, in my opinion, is not nonsense. But we have to be talking about myth and gods in small m's. We have to be talking about cultural stuff in the language of cultural studies, insofar as you find which piece of that language the most valid. But this was basically blither. And you can find all sorts of people about Batman as an aspect of the moon and Superman as an aspect of the sun, and all sorts of stuff that people are just throwing out there. And in the absence of really good information about ownership, publication, authorship, marketing, much of that information that we have now, in the absence of that, people had the readers and even creators, and then readers who became creators, they just ate that shit up and repeated it, and there's just a huge amount of nonsense. So I actually don't have much respect for the way that they talk about it in the text of Aberrant. It just seems to me to be more of that kind of catnip that's basically addling everybody, especially when the comics are so wretched at that point. So let's go on, though. It, meaning the text of Aberrant, gives examples of Batman and Spider-Man. And Sean is a little puzzled by this. He says, but a Nova, which is what you call these characters with powers in Aberrant, a Nova would crush Spider-Man and Batman. And this kind of puzzles Sean. He says, the Novas are new gods or Eternals levels of power, cosmic level stuff. And so you can't play Aberrant like Batman and Spider-Man. So how are those the gods? He's not seeing how this connects. Now, this is actually worth talking about, because it was in the mid to late 80s, and then becoming super embedded in fandom after that, that power levels are a big deal. You have your street level supers, and you've got your medium level supers, and you got your big ones, you got cosmic ones, and it's a big deal. And in role-playing, that became an issue of, well, how do you play when you have these different power levels? And all sorts of fan-based, consumer-based, gaming-based, particularly because role-playing and digital computer Console style gaming was really getting underway at that time, and all of that really involved, power levels. I think it's very badly misplaced. The larger scope of talking about superheroes as mythology in some very basic meaning of that, some much more sort of, Roland Barthes meaning of the word mythologies, rather than this kind of journalistic blither that wasn't really sure what it ever meant. The power level doesn't matter. If you were to talk about Batman as myth, it's hero myth we're talking about. And again, in a much more, don't Campbell me, okay? I'm talking about much better scholars than that. But it really doesn't have to do with anything about how powerful Batman is until you look at the text and see that he prevails. It's that he prevails that makes him powerful, not whether he can level a building with a punch. So the same goes for Spider-Man. The humanity is actually a big piece of the myth. And in the retooling of Batman in about 1970 and adjacent into a more Spider-Man-like figure, where, the trauma of Bruce Wayne is actually a huge piece of it, is right in line with that we want our heroes, our myths, to have that human resonance. And so all of that dialogue is very interesting, and some of it may be crap, and some of it may be drawing upon branches of cultural studies that I find less compelling than others, or you may be reversed. That's all debatable and discussable. That's interesting. We could be doing the same thing for other iconic figures of popular culture, whether it's the persona of an actor, or whether it is the what everybody says about a particular politician, which when we look at the record just isn't the case. All those things are eminently discussable, and they crisscross onto each other, of course. Don't even get me started about music, right? That's enormously important in all of this. But we are not talking about power levels of the different comics characters as godhood. Now, in the fiction, that can matter. In the fiction, people can talk about this. An excellent example comes from Alan Moore's Swamp Thing, when finally, pissed off beyond reasonable endurance, the Swamp Thing goes into Gotham City and basically creates an Eden out of its Central Park, and says, you've arrested my girlfriend and release her now. And Batman, piqued at somebody messing with Gotham, goes into action against the Swamp Thing, gets his ass handed to him instantly, goes to the city council and says, if that's not a god, it's the closest thing we've got to one. Give up the girlfriend. And besides, now that I think about it, that whole thing is fucked anyway. I mean, she's unlawfully detained. I mean, you're being dicks. Give her up. So there's Batman, right? Surrender monkey, quite reasonably, both ethically and practically, because Swamp Thing is basically a god. So, no, I'm not going to fight the Swamp Thing. And he's right anyway. So in the fiction, that distinction can be of great interest. Conversely, we also see in the fiction, particularly in different moments, and I may be cherry picking here, as is the right of anybody talking about superhero comics, very, very well written sequences of the interplay of different so-called power levels, such that in the better histories of the Avengers, with which few are practically familiar, I've found, the interplay of characters such as Thor and Hawkeye and the Beast, or any of these characters of what you might call of differing power levels, the interplay among them is extremely important and very well done, so that effectiveness turns out to be a lot more than just how much damage you can deliver with a blow. It's when, who, and why that blow is delivered that's far more important to the story. So anyway, you cannot play a Barent like the, you know, I guess you would call them the power levels of someone like Spider-Man, Batman, or Hawkeye, as I conceive of those characters, which is not really what you see in the movies. So I get that, but that's irrelevant to whether we talk about them as gods in mythic cultural terms. So the terminology really has to get dissected. What are we talking about? We're talking about mythologies and cultural terms, which has a lot to do with what pop culture even is, in which case power levels are just not an issue. Or we're talking about in the fiction where we have these different power levels and they are either well handled as aspects of how the characters interact, as with the Swamp Thing example and with the vaguer reference I made to some parts of the Avengers, or they're badly handled, in which case the characters just shouldn't be in the same stories because, this dude is helpless because he's, little or something. How that applies to a Barent, well, that mention in the text I think isn't really worth dissecting through as fully as you seem to want, Sean, but it would be worthwhile to consider which level or which lens it's using. It seems in mentioning Batman and Spider-Man that it's really thinking about culture and pop mythology and what we think of as myth without knowing it. We don't ever refer to this in casual conversation, even though it may be very operative in our behaviors and pop up in weird places. A fine example being the Punisher as a military icon, as a war against terror icon, much to the shock and disgust of the creator of the Punisher, Jerry Conway. So that is powerful talk. Worrying about it or thinking about it in terms of, well, is that relevant? Wait, those references aren't the same power level as the characters in the story here in this game. I think that's a different lens, and its quality and its relevance to what's happening in the stories and things like that are its own question. So that's what I've got for this particular topic. Sort of feel like I need a whiteboard with circles and arrows and stuff like that, timelines. But once I start thinking in those terms, there's no going back, and you don't want to go there with me necessarily, I'm sure. All right, that's it for this time. Thank you to everybody. If you've been, tolerating my perorations, if that's what you've been doing, then thank you for that. If you find any of this relevant or to be developed or discussable, please jump in. Let's have it. I look forward to that greatly. I shall be seeing you again next month with more of this stuff. Keep the questions coming. Thanks, everyone.